The heavy silence of the Lagos night is never truly silent. It is a thick, humid curtain of sound, the distant hum of generators, the rustle of palm fronds in a salt-heavy breeze, and the rhythmic lapping of the lagoon against the concrete teeth of the city. But at 3:15 a.m., at an abandoned construction site on the outskirts of Lekki, the silence is different. It is heavy, jagged, and stained. This is where our story begins, not with a scream, but with the eerie, artificial glow of a smartphone screen cutting through the darkness, illuminating a face twisted by a terrifying mixture of adrenaline and cold calculation. Tunde stands there, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged bursts that cloud in the damp air, as he holds the phone out in front of him. He isn't calling for help. He isn't calling the police. He is on a FaceTime call, his eyes darting around the shadows of the skeletal building frames, and as he turns the camera to show the person on the other end what lies at his feet, he whispers 4 words that will haunt a family forever. It is finally done. He doesn't look like a monster in this light. He looks like the man Kemi loved, the man she trusted with her life and the life of their unborn son, Ao. But in this moment, as the digital connection flickers, the mask has not just slipped, it has been incinerated. Kemi was the kind of soul who moved through the world like a gentle breeze, leaving behind the scent of kindness and the warmth of a quiet smile. At 23, she was the pride of her family, a rising star in a prestigious medical firm who spent her days analyzing data to save lives, while her evenings were filled with the joyful, nesting preparations for the miracle growing inside her. She was 8 months pregnant, her belly a soft, prominent curve that she cradled instinctively, a physical manifestation of the future she was building. Because of the physical toll the high-risk pregnancy took on her body, Kemi often used a wheelchair to navigate her apartment, a temporary concession to ensure that little Ao entered the world healthy and strong. She was a woman defined by her resilience and her devotion, a daughter who called her mother every single morning just to hear the comfort of her voice. But on the night of April 10th, that rhythm was shattered. CCTV footage from her apartment complex captures the last known image of Kemi alive. It is 2:25 a.m., the hallway lights are dim, and she is being wheeled toward the exit by Tunde. There is no struggle visible, no outward sign of the horror that is about to unfold. She is simply leaving with the father of her child, disappearing into the velvet mouth of the night. Less than 2 hours later, while the rest of the city slept, a single vibration broke the quiet of Kemi's mother's bedroom. It was 3:50 a.m. The message on the screen came from Kemi's number, but the words felt like ice water in her mother's veins. "I'm leaving. I'm not coming back." In that instant, the world stopped turning. A mother knows her child's heartbeat before it even begins, and she certainly knows the cadence of her daughter's soul. Kemi didn't write like that. Kemi didn't leave without her hospital bag, which sat packed and ready by the door. Kemi, who could barely stand without assistance, did not simply leave into the darkness of a Lagos night. The text was a digital ghost, a fake trail left by a man who thought he could rewrite reality with a few taps on a touch screen. But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the facade began to crumble, revealing a web of deception that stretched far beyond a single night, leading into a past filled with hidden bruises and a darkness that Kemi had tried so hard to keep from those she loved. The disappearance of a loved one is a slow-burning agony, a clock that ticks with the weight of a sledgehammer. As the minutes turned into hours, the confusion shifted into a cold, sharpening clarity for Kemi's family. They didn't just wait for the police. They became the investigators of their own nightmare. They tracked the digital breadcrumbs, pining for a signal, any sign of life, only to find themselves standing at the doorstep of Tunde's mother's house. There, the air felt different, guarded, hostile. Tunde's mother stood like a sentinel of lies, her eyes shifting as she directed the searchers away from the truth, pointing toward distant neighborhoods and false leads while her son was inside, scrubbing the evidence of a life stolen. The car Kemi had been in was missing its identifying marks, the decals peeled away by frantic hands, the interior smelling of industrial cleaner and desperation. Tunde wasn't a grieving partner. He was a man in motion, a man who had already boarded a bus out of the state, using Kemi's own debit card to fund a flight toward a new life with a woman who knew nothing of the blood on his hands or the life he had extinguished in a shallow grave near the bayou. As we peel back the layers of this story, we find that the fake text wasn't the first lie, it was merely the last. We find a history of continuous violence, a record of a man who had been protected by the very system that should have stopped him, a man who used his charm as a weapon until it turned into something much more lethal. We see a family's love transformed into a quest for justice, a brother who refused to stop tracking a signal, and a mother who vowed that her daughter's name and the name of the grandson she never got to hold would be the final words in this tragedy. This is a journey through the heart of betrayal, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we let into our homes, and a call to everyone listening to look closer at the shadows in the lives of those they love. If this story has touched you, or if it reminds you of someone who might be walking a dark path in silence, please share it. Your awareness could be the light that guides someone back to safety. If you have any information regarding cases of domestic safety, or wish to share your support for families seeking justice, leave a comment below. Let us use these stories to build a community that protects its own. Stay vigilant, look out for one another, and never ignore the signs that something is wrong. Now let's continue. The air in the apartment always smelt faintly of lavender and cocoa butter, the scents Kemi used to soothe her skin as her body stretched to accommodate the life growing inside her. It was a home filled with the quiet anticipation of a woman who had already memorized the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Kemi was 23, but she carried herself with the grounded grace of someone much older, a byproduct of the discipline it took to thrive in the medical field. Her world had become smaller in the last few weeks, narrowed down to the four walls of her living room and the soft glow of her laptop as she worked from her wheelchair. The high-risk nature of her pregnancy had robbed her of her physical mobility, but it hadn't touched her spirit. She spent hours scrolling through nursery decor, her fingers tracing the screen as she imagined Ao, her son, sleeping in the crib that still sat in a half-assembled box in the corner. She was happy, or at least, that was the story she told her mother every morning over the phone. She spoke of the baby's kicks and her cravings for spicy jollof rice, carefully omitting the shadow that often stood in the doorway. She didn't talk about the way Tunde's mood could shift like a sudden tropical storm, or how the silence in the apartment would sometimes grow so heavy it felt like it was crushing the breath out of her. To the world, she was a glowing mother-to-be. In reality, she was a woman navigating a minefield, trying to keep the peace for the sake of the child she was so desperate to protect. The night of April 10th began like any other Friday, with the city of Lagos humming outside the window, a distant orchestra of life that felt a world away from the sterile quiet of the apartment. Kemi had been tired, her back aching from the weight of the third trimester, and she had fallen asleep on the sofa while reading a medical journal. Tunde had been restless all evening, pacing the floor with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, jagged murmur that stopped whenever she opened her eyes. At 2 a.m., he woke her gently, too gently in retrospect. He told her they needed to leave, that there was an emergency with his mother or perhaps a problem at the hospital. The lie was small and unremarkable, designed to bypass her intuition. In her groggy state, Kemi didn't question him. She trusted the man who had promised to be a father to her son. CCTV footage from the hallway captures a hauntingly mundane scene at 2:25 a.m. The elevator doors sliding open, Tunde calmly pushing Kemi's wheelchair into the light. She is wrapped in a shawl, her head leaning slightly to the side, perhaps still half asleep. They look like any other couple heading out in the middle of the night, a husband taking care of his pregnant wife. There was no struggle, no frantic look toward the camera. Just the quiet departure of a woman who had no idea she was crossing a threshold she would never return through. By 3:50 a.m., the silence in Kemi's mother's house was shattered by the sharp vibration of a text message. It was a message that would become the first piece of a devastating puzzle. "I'm leaving. I'm not coming back." 6 words that were meant to explain away a disappearance, to paint Kemi as a woman who would abandon her family, her career, and her unborn son in the middle of the night without a word of explanation. But a mother's heart is a finely tuned instrument, and Kemi's mother knew instantly that the song had gone out of tune. Kemi didn't text in short, cold sentences. She used emojis, she called people by their pet names, and above all, she never would have left her hospital bag. That bag, packed with tiny onesies and soft blankets, still sat by the apartment door, a silent witness to the fact that wherever Kemi had gone, she hadn't intended to stay. As the sun began to rise over the city, the fake text didn't provide a cover, it provided a countdown. It was the moment the family realized that the man who had wheeled her out of the apartment was no longer her protector, but the architect of a nightmare that was only just beginning to unfold. If you find these stories important for raising awareness about the hidden realities of domestic struggle, please consider sharing this with someone you care about. Knowledge is often the first step toward safety. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts or to offer support for families seeking justice in silence. Stay alert, and remember that sometimes the most important messages are the ones that aren't sent at all. In the heavy, suffocating silence of the morning after. By 7 a.m., the sun had fully climbed over the Lagos skyline, but for Kemi's family, the light only brought a sharper focus to the nightmare. The apartment, once a sanctuary of soft colors and baby preparations, now felt like a crime scene frozen in time. Kemi's younger brother, Leo, was the first to arrive. He walked through the rooms, his eyes darting from the unmade bed to the kitchen counter where a half-finished glass of water still sat. But it was the sight of the wheelchair, abandoned and pushed haphazardly against the wall, that made his blood run cold. Kemi never went anywhere without it. It was her lifeline. To see it sitting there, empty and cold, was the loudest proof that she hadn't left on her own accord. He picked up her hospital bag, the one she had meticulously packed with AO's first outfits, and felt the weight of it. It was still heavy, still full. No woman at 8 months pregnant, especially one as organized and devoted as Kemi, would walk out of her life without the very things meant to keep her baby safe. The search moved quickly from the apartment to the digital world. Leo, a tech-savvy young man who had always been protective of his sister, didn't wait for a police report to be filed. He sat on the floor of the living room, his laptop balanced on his knees, and began the frantic process of Find My Phone. He watched the blue dot on the screen with bated breath, praying it would show her at a friend's house or a nearby cafe. Instead, the signal pinged miles away, nestled in a residential pocket of the city he recognized all too well, the neighborhood where Tunde's mother lived. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Why would Kemi's phone be there if Tunde claimed he hadn't seen her? Why was the signal stationary in a place where Tunde's mother acted as a gatekeeper? Without a second thought, Leo and his parents piled into their car, the engine roaring to life as they raced toward the address, their hearts hammering against their ribs in a synchronized rhythm of fear and fury. When they arrived at the house, the atmosphere was thick with a calculated, chilling calm. Tunde's mother met them at the gate, her face a mask of practiced indifference. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer to help search. Instead, she stood her ground, her voice steady as she told them Tunde wasn't there and that she hadn't seen Kemi in days. But as she spoke, the family noticed a car parked in the shadows of the driveway, Kemi's car. It looked different. The custom stickers Kemi had placed on the bumper were gone, peeled away so roughly that the residue still clung to the paint. The windows were rolled down, and the faint scent of heavy-duty bleach wafted out into the morning air. Then, the side door of the house creaked open, and Tunde stepped out. He wasn't wearing the clothes he'd had on in the CCTV footage. He was in fresh clothes, his skin damp as if he'd just stepped out of a long shower. When Leo confronted him, demanding to know where his sister was, Tunde didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply stared back with hollow eyes and said, "She left me. I don't know where she went." It was a lie so cold it felt like a declaration of war. The air in front of Tunde's mother's house was charged with a heavy, electric tension, the kind that precedes a violent storm. As Tunde stood there in his fresh clothes, offering nothing but hollow denials, Kemi's brother Leo felt a shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just that Tunde was lying, it was the practiced, almost bored way he delivered the falsehoods. While his mother stood like a stone wall behind him, Tunde began to move with a strange, frantic energy. He wasn't looking for Kemi, he was looking for an exit. Under the watchful, suspicious eyes of Kemi's family, Tunde began loading a bin into the trunk of his mother's car. The same car that now sat scrubbed clean, its identity stripped away along with Kemi's decals. Inside that bin were muddy shoes and heavy-duty cleaning supplies, the tools of a man who had spent the dawn hours attempting to wash away a nightmare. He didn't stay to help the search. Instead, he climbed into the passenger seat as his mother drove him away, leaving Kemi's family standing in the dust of the driveway, clutching a phone signal that refused to move. With Tunde in flight, the family turned their desperation toward the one thing they could control: information. They began to dig into the life Tunde had kept tucked away in the dark corners of his history. What they found was a chilling pattern that shattered the image of the loving father Tunde had projected. This wasn't a case of a relationship gone wrong. It was a cycle of continuous violence that had been spinning for years. They discovered a trail of police reports from other cities, stories of other women who had looked into the same hollow eyes and felt the same cold fear. They learned that Tunde had been released from custody only months prior for an assault that had been pleaded down to a minor offense, a sweetheart deal that had placed him right back into Kemi's life. The bruises Kemi had hidden, the quiet way she had stopped laughing, the fear she had masked as pregnancy fatigue. It all began to form a terrifying picture of a woman who had been living in a cage, trying to protect her unborn son from the very man who claimed to love them. The act of betrayal was finalized not in a moment of passion, but in a cold, calculated sequence of movements. While Kemi's family pleaded with local authorities to take the fake text seriously, Tunde was already miles away. He had boarded a bus, crossing state lines with the cold efficiency of a seasoned traveler. He wasn't alone in his mind. He was already using Kemi's own debit card to fund his escape, reaching out to a woman he had met on a gaming app, someone who saw his charm but knew nothing of the blood on his hands. As night fell on the first full day of Kemi's disappearance, the realization settled over her family like a shroud. The man who had wheeled her out of her apartment was gone. The fake text had bought him the time he needed, and somewhere in the vast, unforgiving landscape outside the city, Kemi and baby Ao were waiting to be found. The search was no longer about a disappearance. It was a race against a predator who had been hidden in plain sight all along. The investigation into Kemi's disappearance quickly transformed from a localized search into a complex tracking operation as the sun began to set on the second day. While Tunde was fleeing across state lines, the digital footprint he left behind began to tell a story he hadn't prepared for. Every time he used Kemi's debit card, at a gas station in a neighboring state, at a fast food drive-thru, a silent alarm was triggered in the family's makeshift command center. They watched in real time as the man who claimed he didn't know where she went moved further and further away from the city where she had last been seen. It was a trail of arrogance, the actions of a man who believed he had successfully redirected the narrative with a single fake text. But as the investigators followed the money, they also began to follow the data from Tunde's own devices, uncovering a secret life he had carefully curated on gaming apps and encrypted messaging platforms. It was through these digital cracks that a new figure emerged, a woman in a distant city who had been expecting Tunde's arrival. She wasn't an accomplice, she was another potential victim, a woman who had been charmed by the same mask Tunde had worn for Kemi. To her, he was a successful businessman coming to visit for a romantic getaway. She had no idea that the man she was waiting for was currently the subject of a multi-state manhunt, or that the money he was using to travel belonged to a woman who was still missing. When the authorities finally made contact with her, the shock was palpable. She described Tunde as sweet and attentive, a stark contrast to the man who had been caught on camera cleaning a crime scene and scrubbing decals off a car. This revelation provided a crucial piece of the puzzle, confirming that Tunde's flight wasn't a panic-driven escape, but a calculated move to abandon one life and slip into another. Back in the quiet marshlands on the outskirts of the city, the physical search took a darker turn. K9 units and specialized search teams were deployed to the area where Tunde's phone had pinged during that mysterious FaceTime call at 3:15 a.m. The terrain was unforgiving, thick with mangrove roots, knee-deep in brackish water, and shrouded in a heavy mist that seemed to cling to the searcher's skin. This wasn't a place someone would wander into by mistake. As the teams pushed deeper into the brush, they found the first physical evidence. A discarded piece of fabric that Kemi's mother identified as part of the shawl Kemi had been wearing in the CCTV footage. The discovery sent a wave of somber reality through the search party. The hope that Kemi had truly gone away for a while, as the text message claimed, was evaporating, replaced by the grim realization that the answer lay somewhere in the silence of the woods. The investigation hit a critical turning point when the digital investigation merged with a sudden, chilling breakthrough from a living witness. While search teams were scouring the marshlands for any sign of Kemi, a woman named Sarah, who had once been an acquaintance of Tunde, finally walked into a police precinct 3 states away. She looked haunted, her hands trembling as she handed over her phone to the investigators. She told them about a FaceTime call she had received in the early hours of April 11th, a call she had initially tried to block out of her mind because the horror of it was too vast to process. She described Tunde's face on the screen, illuminated by the cold, blue light of the phone, and how he had turned the camera to show her a dark, disturbed patch of earth in a wooded area. He had bragged about how easy it was to remove an obstacle, and told her that he was finally free to start over. This wasn't just a lead, it was a confession caught in the digital ether. Armed with the coordinates from Sarah's phone, the search intensified, focusing on a specific, desolate stretch of land near the industrial shipyards. The atmosphere among the searchers changed. The frantic energy of the first 48 hours settled into a somber, determined silence. It was here that the investigation unearthed the physical reality of Tunde's betrayal. In a shallow grave, partially hidden by the dense overgrowth and discarded construction debris, the recovery teams found Kemi. The scene was a devastating confirmation of the violence she had endured, violence she had carefully hidden from her family for months. Next to her was the small, heartbreaking evidence of the life she had been carrying, baby Ao, who would never see the light of day. The fake text that claimed she was leaving and not coming back was revealed as a cruel, final act of gaslighting, a message sent over her body before it was even cold. As the news of the discovery reached the command center, the grief was a physical weight that seemed to crush the very air out of the room. Kemi's father, a man of quiet strength, stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the map of the search area. Her mother's voice, usually so filled with warmth, became a hollow whisper as she spoke about the numbness that had taken over. But beneath the grief, a fierce, burning demand for justice began to take root. They weren't just mourning a daughter, they were mourning the future that had been stolen from them. The first steps Ao would never take, the graduations and weddings that had been erased by a man's ego and rage. The focus of the investigation now shifted entirely to the manhunt for Tunde, who was still moving through the country, unaware that his digital confession had already sealed his fate. While the forensic teams worked the site, the police began a systematic takedown of Tunde's support network. They returned to his mother's house, this time with a warrant and a different tone. The protective silence she had maintained was now legally categorized as obstruction. They found Kemi's missing belongings hidden in the attic, along with the remnants of the car decals Tunde had tried to destroy. The web of lies was being pulled apart, thread by thread, revealing a man who had been enabled by those around him for far too long. Tunde's mother, who had once stood so defiantly at the gate, was now forced to watch as her son's true nature was broadcast to the world. The trail led the Nigerian police to a nondescript motel on the edge of a highway in a different state. Tunde had been staying there under an assumed name, still using Kemi's debit card for minor purchases, seemingly convinced that he was untouchable. When the tactical team breached the door, they found him sitting on the edge of the bed, a laptop open in front of him. He didn't look like the charismatic man Kemi had fallen for. He looked small, cornered, and utterly devoid of remorse. Even as he was being handcuffed, he remained defiant, his only concern being how he appeared to the officers. The mask was gone, and in its place was the reality of a predator who had finally run out of room to hide. The arrest of Tunde in that flickering motel room was not the end of the nightmare, but rather the beginning of a grueling, public confrontation with the truth. As he was let out in handcuffs, his head bowed not in shame, but in a calculated attempt to avoid the camera lenses, the story of Kemi and baby Ao began to resonate far beyond the borders of Lagos. Back at the shipyard recovery site, the atmosphere remained heavy as forensic investigators meticulously documented every inch of the earth. They found that the shallow grave had been dug with a chilling lack of care, a final insult to a woman who had spent her life building things of beauty and structure. The discovery of the small, hand-knitted blanket Kemi had kept in her car, now stained and discarded nearby, became a symbol of the future that had been ruthlessly extinguished. It was a physical manifestation of a mother's love, intended to wrap a newborn in warmth, found instead in the cold damp of a burial site. In the days that followed, the protective silence that had shielded Tunde began to erode under the weight of the evidence. His mother, who had once stood as a defiant sentinel at her gate, was brought in for a series of intense interrogations. The investigators presented her with the evidence of the scrubbed car and the removed decals, actions that moved her from the role of a mother to that of a criminal accomplice. The community, once quiet out of a mixture of shock and fear, began to find its voice. Neighbors who had seen Tunde's late-night movements or heard the muffled sounds of earlier arguments finally stepped out of the shadows. They spoke of a man who used his charm like a cloak, hiding a volatile temper that flared whenever he felt his control over Kemi slipping. This collective testimony painted a portrait of a predator who didn't just snap, but who had spent months systematically isolating Kemi from everyone who could have saved her. The most devastating moment for the family came during the formal identification. Kemi's father, a man who had always been the pillar of their home, had to walk into a sterile room to confirm that the vibrant, ambitious woman he had raised was now a statistic in a domestic violence report. He spoke later of the deafening silence of the room, a silence that stood in stark contrast to the lively debates about architecture and medicine that used to fill their dinner table. The grief was not a single wave but a constant, suffocating tide. Yet, amidst the mourning, a powerful movement began to swell. Kemi's colleagues and friends organized a Justice for Kemi walk, filling the streets with the color she loved most, a soft lavender, and carrying signs that bore the image of the fake text as a warning to others. They wanted the world to know that Kemi wasn't just a victim. She was a sister, a daughter, and a brilliant mind who had been silenced by the very man who should have been her greatest advocate. As the legal proceedings began, the family, led by Kemi's mother, declared their intention to attend every single hearing, to be a constant, visible reminder of the lives that were lost. They didn't just want a conviction, they wanted a systemic change. They wanted to know why the warnings had been ignored, and why a man with a documented history of continuous violence was ever allowed near a vulnerable woman in a high-risk pregnancy. The courtroom became a battlefield for Kemi's legacy, a place where the fake text was dissected not as a message of departure, but as a signature of a killer who thought he could outsmart a mother's intuition. The final memorial for Kemi and baby Ao was a testament to the impact one life can have. Thousands gathered, not just to mourn, but to stand in solidarity against the silence that allows abuse to thrive. As lavender balloons were released into the Lagos sky, Kemi's mother stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but clear. She spoke directly to the cameras, her eyes piercing the lens as she delivered a final plea. Do not let the fake texts be the last word. If you see the bruises, if you hear the threats, or if you feel the isolation, speak. Do not wait for the silence of the grave to tell the truth. The story of Kemi and Ao became a lighthouse, a tragic but necessary warning that behind the most charming masks can lie the most calculated shadows. The aftermath of the recovery shifted from the frantic energy of a search to the cold, clinical reality of a courtroom. As the sun rose on the first Monday following the discovery in the marshlands, the state of the case against Tunde began to solidify into an ironclad narrative of premeditation. The fake text sent at 3:50 a.m. became the centerpiece of the prosecution's opening arguments. It wasn't just a distraction, it was presented as a digital fingerprint of intent. Forensic analysts testified that the language used in that message, void of Kemi's typical warmth and littered with uncharacteristic phrasing, matched the linguistic patterns found in Tunde's own sent folders. The jury was shown a side-by-side comparison of Kemi's vibrant, emoji-filled messages to her mother and the cold, 6-word death sentence Tunde had typed over her body. The courtroom remained pin-drop silent as the prosecution played the recovered FaceTime audio from Sarah's phone. Hearing Tunde's voice, calm and almost proud, as he described clearing the path for his new life, sent a visible shudder through the gallery. Kemi's mother sat in the front row, her hand clutching a small photo of Kemi and a sonogram of baby Ao, her eyes fixed not on the screen but on Tunde. He sat at the defense table, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, still wearing the mask of a misunderstood man. But as the evidence mounted, the GPS data from his mother's car, the receipts for the industrial bleach, and the surveillance footage of him scrubbing the decals, the mask began to look more like a shroud. A major focus of this stage was the testimony of the silent witnesses. Medical examiners detailed the continuous violence Kemi had suffered in the weeks leading up to her death, bruises in various stages of healing that she had meticulously covered with long sleeves and heavy makeup. This painted a devastating picture of Kemi's final months. She wasn't just a woman who went missing. She was a woman who had been a prisoner in her own home, trying to negotiate her survival and the survival of her son with a man who viewed them as property. The prosecution argued that the sweetheart deal Tunde had received for his prior assault was the ultimate failure of the system, a loophole that had essentially signed Kemi's death warrant. Outside the courthouse, the community, the thousands of people who had followed the search from day one, had grown into a movement. They occupied the sidewalks, not with anger, but with a somber, unwavering presence. They created a wall of life for Kemi, covered in architectural sketches she had made in photos of her smiling at her baby shower. It was a reminder to the jury and the public that Kemi was more than a victim. She was a brilliance that had been extinguished. The trial wasn't just about a crime. It was a reckoning for a city and a judicial system that had allowed a predator to walk among the innocent for far too long. The trial moved into its most agonizing phase as the defense attempted to construct a narrative of a voluntary disappearance, a desperate move that only deepened the pain of those sitting in the gallery. Tunde's legal team argued that the high-risk nature of the pregnancy and the looming pressure of motherhood had caused Kemi to have a mental breakdown, claiming she had asked to be taken away to start over. They suggested the text message was an authentic expression of her state of mind. But this line of defense was quickly dismantled by the digital evidence. The prosecution brought a forensic linguist to the stand who pointed out that the phone had stayed in Tunde's possession for 3 hours after the text was sent, moving in a pattern that perfectly matched his mother's vehicle's GPS. There was no evidence of Kemi's phone ever being used by her again. The most explosive moment of the trial came when the mystery woman, Tunde, had met on the gaming app took the stand via video link. She testified that while Kemi's family was frantically searching for her, Tunde was sending her photos of a new life he planned to build with her, using Kemi's stolen money to buy gifts that he promised to bring. She revealed that Tunde had told her his previous life had been resolved, and that he was now a free man. This testimony stripped away any remaining doubt about the premeditated nature of the crime. He hadn't just reacted in a moment of heat. He had been auditioning a replacement for Kemi while she was still breathing, treating her life like a contract he could simply terminate. The cross-examination of Tunde's mother was equally devastating. Under the pressure of the prosecution's questioning, her story of protective silence began to fracture. She was forced to admit that she had seen the scratches on Tunde's arms the morning Kemi went missing, and that she had personally helped him discard the cleaning supplies used on the car. The courtroom watched as a mother's misguided loyalty was exposed as a secondary betrayal. A woman who had helped hide the truth of a daughter-in-law's murder and the death of her own grandson. By the time she stepped down, the air in the room felt heavy with the weight of her complicity. As the jury prepared to deliberate, the prosecution's closing statement didn't focus on the technicalities of the law, but on the humanity of the victims. They projected a final image onto the courtroom screen, a photo of the nursery Kemi had half assembled. The box for the crib was still open, the tiny blankets still folded. They reminded the jury that Kemi wasn't just a name on a docket. She was an architect of a future that had been demolished. The fake text was held up one last time, a digital scar that proved Tunde wanted to not only kill Kemi, but to assassinate her character as well. The state rested its case, leaving the fate of the man who had tried to rewrite Kemi's life in the hands of 12 strangers who had now seen the monster behind the mask. The verdict was read in a courtroom where the very air seemed to hold its breath. When the word guilty echoed through the chamber, repeated for 2 counts of capital homicide for the lives of Kemi and baby Ao, the wall of silence finally broke. Kemi's mother didn't scream. She let out a long, shuddering breath, as if she were finally exhaling the poison that had been forced into her lungs the moment she read that fake text on April 10th. Tunde, for the first time since the ordeal began, looked truly small. The arrogance that had fueled his FaceTime confessions and his digital deceptions had vanished, replaced by the hollow realization that no amount of cleaning or lying could scrub away the truth. The judge's sentencing was a searing indictment of a man who had treated a miracle of life as a mere inconvenience. He pointed to the continuous violence that had preceded the murder, noting that the system's previous leniency had been a failure that would haunt the community for years. Tunde was sentenced to the maximum penalty, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to mask his darkness behind a charming smile. As he was led away, he didn't look at the cameras, he didn't look at his mother, who sat weeping in the back row. He was finally a man without a script, a man whose story had been ended by the very truth he tried to bury. In the weeks following the trial, Kemi's family began the long, agonizing process of reclaiming her memory from the tragedy that had defined her final moments. They returned to her apartment one last time, not to search for clues, but to pack away the things that represented who she truly was. They found her architectural blueprints, complex, beautiful designs for low-cost housing that showed her heart for the community. They found the journals where she had written letters to Ao, telling him about the world she couldn't wait to show him. These were the real messages of Kemi's life, far more powerful than the 6-word lie Tunde had sent from her phone. To honor her legacy, the family established a foundation dedicated to providing immediate legal and housing assistance for women in high-risk pregnancies facing domestic threats. They wanted to ensure that the next Kemi wouldn't have to keep her bruises a secret to protect her family, and that the next Tunde would be stopped long before he reached for a phone to send a fake text. At the unveiling of a memorial park named in her honor, Kemi's father looked at the lavender trees swaying in the breeze and said, he thought he could make her disappear, but all he did was make her voice louder. The story of Kemi and Ao remains a permanent fixture in the hearts of the community, a narrative of a life that was taken too soon, but a spirit that could never be silenced. The finality of the verdict did not bring an end to the story, but rather shifted it into a new, somber reality where the living had to learn how to exist in the spaces Kemi and Ao had left behind. In the first weeks following the sentencing, the apartment complex in Lekki, which had once been a site of such vibrant hope and later a scene of chilling CCTV footage, became a place of pilgrimage. People from all over the city who had followed the African Tale Network coverage began to leave flowers and small, hand-knitted baby booties at the gate. The silence that had once been filled with Tunde's lies was now filled with a collective, quiet mourning. Kemi's family eventually returned to the rooms where the nightmare began, not to look for evidence, but to reclaim the physical pieces of her life. They found the architectural drafts she had been working on late into the night, her vision for a better world preserved in precise, elegant lines on tracing paper. They found the sonogram photos tucked into the pages of her Bible, images of a son who would remain forever unborn, a testament to the future Tunde had tried to erase. The legal victory also sparked a fierce, necessary conversation about the sweetheart deals that had allowed a predator like Tunde to remain in Kemi's orbit. Her mother and brother, Leo, became the faces of a new legislative push to reform how domestic violence cases are handled. They spoke at town halls and met with judicial oversight committees, using the fake text as a literal exhibit of how abusers use deception to buy time. They argued that the system had been an unwitting accomplice by failing to track Tunde's history of continuous violence. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about ensuring that no other family would have to stand in a shipyard at 3:15 a.m. looking for a grave. The Justice for Kemi movement transformed into a foundation that provided real-time tracking for at-risk women, creating a digital safety net that Tunde's masks could never penetrate. The legacy of Kemi and Ao was eventually etched into the very skyline of the city she loved. The Kemi Memorial Housing Project, based on the final blueprints found in her apartment, was officially commissioned on the 3rd anniversary of her disappearance. It stood as a collection of sustainable, inclusive homes designed specifically for single mothers and families in transition, a physical manifestation of the protection she had tried to provide for her own son. On the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the atmosphere was not one of mourning, but of a quiet architectural triumph. Her parents stood at the entrance of the main building, where a small plaque bore her name and a quote from her journals. "To build a home is to build a future that outlasts the storm." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long, golden glow over the new neighborhood, Leo sat on a bench in the courtyard. He watched children playing in the communal areas and saw mothers sitting together, sharing stories in the safety of a space his sister had imagined into existence. The fake text that once threatened to define her end had been completely overwritten by the reality of these lives. Tunde's name was never mentioned. He had become a ghost, a cautionary footnote in a much larger story of community resilience. The silence of the marshlands had been replaced by the laughter of children and the steady, rhythmic hum of a neighborhood that Kemi had built from the ground up, even from beyond the veil. The final frame of this journey rests on the family's living room wall, where a new portrait of Kemi hangs. In it, she isn't the victim from the CCTV footage or the center of a courtroom battle. She is a vibrant young woman with a pencil behind her ear, leaning over a drafting table, her face illuminated by the light of a new idea. Her mother often sits in the chair opposite the portrait, a cup of tea in her hand, talking to her daughter as if she were just in the next room. There is no more anger, no more frantic searching, only the deep, abiding peace of a mother who knows her child is finally home and that her story will continue to protect and inspire generations to come. The message of Kemi's life was never a text sent in the dark. It was the light she left behind for everyone else to follow. This story is a sobering reminder that the people closest to us can sometimes hide the darkest shadows. The fake text sent from Kemi's phone was a calculated attempt to silence her voice, but it ended up becoming the very spark that ignited a search for the truth. It reminds us that intuition is a powerful tool. When Kemi's mother sensed that those 6 short words didn't belong to her daughter, she didn't just see a message. She saw a red flag that eventually led to justice. As we close this chapter, let it be a call to action for all of us to look a little closer at the lives of those we love. Deception often thrives in isolation, and the most dangerous masks are those worn with a smile. If you or someone you know is navigating a situation that feels heavy, silent, or controlled, Do not wait for a reason to speak up. Your voice is a bridge to safety, and your awareness is a shield for those who may not be able to protect themselves. Thank you for walking through this narrative with us. May the legacy of Kemi and baby Ao serve as a lighthouse, guiding others toward help and ensuring that no more stories are ended by a message that was never meant to be sent. Stay vigilant, stay connected, and always trust your heart when something feels out of tune. We will continue to share these stories, seeking the truth and honoring those who can no longer speak for themselves. Until next time, stay safe and see you at our next story. Thank you for watching.